I slid the key card, and the heavy door to room 1408 clicked open. I nudged my suitcase inside and froze. Sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed was Vanessa Hart, the woman I had clashed with in every single conference room for the last 3 years. Her luggage was already unpacked. Her laptop was closed. Her eyes possessed a sudden, quiet brightness I had never seen during our corporate battles. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto mine. "One bed. Don't make it awkward, Foster." My ears burned hot before the blush even reached my face. My hand reflexively climbed to the back of my neck, my knuckles brushing against my father's silver Parker pen, tucked safely into the breast pocket directly over my heart. 3 days later, she would confess to me that she had bought her own identical pen just 2 days after she first saw mine. My name is Dylan Foster. I am 34 years old, and for 8 years I've worked as a senior strategist at Halden & Kite, a mid-sized advertising agency on the 14th floor of the West Monroe building in the Chicago Loop. I live alone in a modest condo in Lincoln Park, where my window looks down on a single maple tree. Every autumn, without fail, that tree turns a brilliant, fiery red a full week before any other on the block. I've been divorced for 3 years. No children. My ex-wife, Sydney Marlowe, was the only child of the Marlowe Communications dynasty. She desperately wanted me to leave Halden & Kite to work for her father. I refused. She called me small. We signed the papers on a quiet July afternoon. No shouting, no tears. Walking out onto Michigan Avenue that day, I felt a strange, weightless relief in my shoulders, like a man whose fever had finally broken. The pen in my pocket had belonged to my father, a Chicago copywriter in the 80s who passed away the year I turned 26. It is a slim silver Parker with a faint scratch near the nib. It lives in the left breast pocket of every shirt I own, resting exactly where he used to carry it. His 3 fundamental rules of writing are still taped to the bezel of my work monitor. Around the agency, they call me the quiet closer, the guy they quietly wake up the night before a crucial pitch is about to die, just to see if I can pull it back from the grave. My closest friend at the office is Blake Iverson, an art director who eats too loudly, laughs too loudly, and nudges my shoulder whenever he senses I'm about to say something entirely too honest. And then, there is Vanessa, 30 years old, senior copywriter, and the only person in the entire building who dares to cut off my sentences mid-air. For 3 years, she had contested everything I proposed. Fonts, taglines, media splits, even the hex code of a button on a landing page. The creative department called us the Foster Hart Weather System. Someone once put $50 on the office whiteboard betting one of us would resign before the year ended. Nobody ever collected. The team building retreat was mandatory. 3 days at the Lake Geneva Resort in Wisconsin. A rustic, dark wood, yellow-lit haven stretched along a quiet finger of the lake. That same weekend, the resort was co-hosting an industry summit sponsored by Sterling Reed, the agency where Sydney was now an account director. I knew this before boarding the shuttle. I got in anyway. The drive north took 2.5 hours. I sat in the very back row with my earbuds in, catching myself glancing at the driver's rearview mirror exactly 3 times, only to see if Vanessa was actually asleep or just pretending to be. Somewhere near the Wisconsin border, Blake elbowed me in the ribs. "Foster, if you and Hart end up in the same breakout group this weekend, I'm charging admission." I told him I hoped we wouldn't. It was a lie, though I didn't realize it until the words had already escaped my lips. The resort lobby smelled of cedar and wood smoke. My suitcase wheels made a hollow, rhythmic clicking against the stone floor. The young receptionist, Marissa, frowned at her screen. "Sir, I am so sorry, but your room has been double booked. The only available bed left in the entire resort tonight is in a twin suite reserved under a Miss Hart. If you'd like..." I can call up and ask her. I told her to make the call. It rang for barely a second and a half before Marissa spoke. Oh, okay. That was fast. Thank you, ma'am. She handed me a freshly printed key card. I took the elevator up alone, suitcase in my right hand, my left thumb resting habitually against the silver clip of the pen in my pocket. 14th floor. The plush hallway carpet swallowed the sound of my steps. Room 1408. I took a breath, tapped the card, and pushed the door open. During the elevator ride, I had convinced myself this would be entirely fine. What I hadn't braced for was the expression on her face. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't wearing her defensive professional mask. She was, and it took me 3 days to find the right word, ready. The next 24 hours unfolded in a series of quiet, effortless agreements, though I didn't realize then that we were listening to the sound of a 3-year rivalry gently dismantling itself. I offered to take the sofa. She waved me off without looking up from her papers. Foster, we've shared a tiny conference room for 3 years. This bed is bigger than my first apartment. Split it. She said it so easily, like a woman who had rehearsed the line a long time ago and had finally found the perfect moment to use it. When she casually mentioned the drive had given her a headache, I didn't think twice. I walked to the small kettle in the corner, boiled water, and found a mint tea bag. I set the steaming mug on her nightstand without a word. Vanessa stared at the cup for a long, silent moment. Then she looked up at me, a soft, unreadable emotion passing over her features. Thank you, Dylan. She didn't call me Foster. It was the first time in 3 years she had ever used my first name. I let the intimacy of it settle in the room, refusing to comment on it, knowing that pointing it out might make it vanish. Before turning off my bedside lamp, I took my father's silver Parker out of my pocket and placed it beside the alarm clock. It felt incredibly vulnerable leaving it exposed in a room that wasn't entirely my own. Her eyes caught it instantly. That's not a work pen, she said softly. Nobody brings a Parker like that to a fluorescent boardroom. I gave her the short version. My father, the Chicago copywriter, gone when I was 26, and his 3 rules still taped to my monitor. She held entirely still for a single beat. Then she whispered, "Your father sounds like someone I would have loved to meet." I opened my mouth to ask her something in return, but before the words could form, she reached over and clicked off her light, plunging us into the dark. The next morning's workshop was filled with bad coffee, dried-out markers, and 6 small groups tasked with building a mock campaign for a fictional artisan coffee brand. Naturally, Vanessa and I were placed in the same group. For 3 years, this would have guaranteed an argument by minute 9. But that morning, she simply slid the dry erase marker across the table to me, sat closely on my right, and only spoke when she noticed me drifting toward a weak concept. When she did speak, her voice was different, lower, calmer, devoid of any corporate armor. Blake strolled past our whiteboard, stopped dead for 3 seconds, and stared at us like a man watching his own house burn down from across the street, before walking off without a word. The other 2 members of our group exchanged glances and quickly looked away. At lunch, Blake cornered me at the buffet, his plate stacked in a way that defied gravity. "Foster, 2 hours, 0 shouting. Are you 2 dying? Is this the rapture?" "We're strategizing," I replied. "Aha, that's what my parents called it right before they got divorced." I laughed, standing 3 feet behind him with a coffee cup. Vanessa laughed too, quietly shielding her smile with her palm. Blake heard her but, to his credit, chose not to turn around. The afternoon session was called Campaign Confessions. The facilitator paired us up and instructed us to describe a past project we had personally ruined and what it had taught us. Vanessa chose a mentor-mentee campaign from her previous agency. She spoke of a young designer she had mentored named Priya, describing in careful, deliberate words a moment at a conference in Cannes when she had failed to protect the girl from a senior executive who wanted to tear her apart on stage. Someone else stepped in and defended her that day, Vanessa said softly. I was too slow, but I never forgot who it was. Who was it? I asked. She redirected the conversation with a fluid grace that I only later realized had taken her 3 years to perfect. With a 1-hour break before dinner, she asked if I wanted to walk by the water. In 3 years, we had never asked each other for anything that didn't involve a copy edit. Yes, I said. We walked for 20 minutes along a dirt path cushioned with pine needles, the silence between us comfortable. Finally, she broke it. Foster, why do you always let the junior writers talk over you in meetings? Because someone did it for me when I was junior, I said. He didn't have to. Who? My dad. She went quiet for a long time. It was a heavy, resonant silence, the kind of quiet that makes a vast lake feel like an intimate room. We eventually turned back, returning to the resort without another word. Dinner was at a cramped Italian place on Lake Geneva's main strip. 6 of us were squeezed around a table meant for 4. Blake, me, Vanessa, and 3 account executives who kept ordering more bread. When the waiter came to take drink orders, Vanessa waved off the menu. Bourbon neat for him, Buffalo Trace if you have it. The waiter nodded and wrote it down. I looked at her, but she didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the waiter, wearing the faint, perfect smile of a woman who had absolutely no intention of explaining herself. Blake laughed so loudly that people at the neighboring table turned around. Foster, she knows your drink. Apparently, I said. She knows a lot of things. Vanessa still didn't turn her head. Back in our room, she opened her laptop at the small desk to jot down some notes. Reaching into her laptop sleeve, she pulled out a silver Parker pen. It wasn't just similar to mine, it was nearly identical. Same size, same brushed finish, same slim clip, though the angle of her clip was a fraction of a hair different. I was at the bathroom sink brushing my teeth when I saw it reflected in the mirror. A sudden, nameless ache bloomed in my chest. I forced my voice to sound casual. Nice pen. For late nights, she replied. Where did you get it? She hesitated for a half second, a tiny fragment of time I would remember for the rest of my life. A conference. Years ago. She didn't specify which one. Her hand rested completely still on her keyboard. We shared the bed for a second night, lying on our backs in the pitch black, both turned slightly away from one another. Between us lay 30 centimeters of pristine white sheet and 3 years of unasked questions. On the nightstand, resting 10 centimeters apart, were our 2 silver Parkers. Mine on a leather coaster, hers on the cover of her notebook, both catching the pale, filtered light bouncing off the lake outside. Sometime after midnight, when she assumed I was asleep, her voice drifted into the dark, incredibly soft. You always were the quietest person in the room, Foster. I don't know why I thought fighting you would work. I didn't dare breathe. I lay there for hours, listening to the gentle hum of the heater, watching the rippling reflections of the lake play across the ceiling, breathing in the faint scent of the mint tea I had brewed her, and the cool, metallic presence of 2 identical pens resting almost close enough to touch. She had spoken my name twice that day. Once by the kettle, and once in the dark of a shared bed. Both times, the sharp, defensive office tone was entirely absent. It sounded as though my name were a fragile, precious object she had carried for a very long time, and had finally allowed herself to set down. I lay there realizing that every single argument we had ever had might have been about something neither of us had the courage to say. I didn't know what it was yet. I only knew that the pen on the nightstand was no longer alone, and the woman who owned its twin had never once told me where she bought it. On the third morning, Sydney Marlowe stepped out of the C-wing elevator like an uninvited ghost from my past. In the 10 hours that followed, she managed to build a quiet bomb, place it precisely beneath Vanessa's feet, and vanish before I ever heard the detonation. I had gone downstairs early. I was waiting at the lobby coffee bar when I spotted Sydney holding a latte that looked too large for her hands. Her smile was the exact one she had wore throughout our 5-year marriage. The look of a woman who behaves as if a camera is watching her even when the room is empty. "Dylan," she said, "what are the odds?" The odds were actually quite high, given her agency was sponsoring the summit, but I let her have the moment. She asked about my mother, the agency, and the maple tree outside my Lincoln Park condo, the one she always hated because it dropped seeds on her car. "Still buried in the same old building," she murmured gently, the way one might note that an old dog had aged decently. "Still refusing to grow up." I offered a polite, empty response. Just then, Vanessa stepped off the elevator. She saw us, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then walked right past us as if we were nothing but lobby furniture. Sydney watched her walk away, her gaze lingering with sharp, professional scrutiny. "She's pretty, Dylan. Does she know?" "Know what?" I asked. "That you don't do again." At lunch, Blake sat across from me at an outdoor table, staring at me suspiciously over a burger. "Foster, that was Sydney at the counter, right?" I nodded. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You always say that," Blake muttered. "Once, just once, try saying no." I laughed it off. I didn't say no. It was a mistake I would carry on a very short list of things I would desperately go back and change if I could. The afternoon featured a poolside mixer, a crowded, joint event between our retreat and the industry summit. White wine, wicker furniture, and warm Edison bulbs strung across the terrace. I found myself cornered by a vice president who wanted to explain AI personalization to me in the patronizing tone one might use to explain the ocean to a child. The entire time, a hyper-vigilant part of my brain tracked Sydney's movements across the patio, from the bar to the terrace edge, then gone. It was a survival skill I had never asked for and had never lost. I wasn't present for the conversation that followed. I would piece it together later from what Vanessa told me and what Blake observed from 20 feet away. Sydney had approached Vanessa at the bar, extending a hand that was a fraction too warm, a fraction too fast. "Vanessa Hart, I've heard your name. Dylan's mentioned you." I hadn't. Sydney was fishing. Then, according to Blake, Sydney's voice dropped into that intimate, conspiratorial register she reserved for making people lean in. "He and I don't talk much anymore. Not since... Well, he probably hasn't told you why we actually split. He never tells anyone. It's the one thing I still love about him. How quiet he is about the hard things." A calculated, devastating pause. "We lost a baby. 14 weeks. He couldn't stand to stay in the house after that. I never blamed him. I hope she's someone who understands that some men don't ever come back all the way." Vanessa said something in reply. She would later tell me she couldn't even remember what, and immediately left via the service elevator to avoid running into me. I returned to our room just before 6. Vanessa was standing by the window, her back to me, her shoulders set high and rigid, the posture of someone fighting hard not to shake. She didn't turn around. "I'm taking the couch tonight. I have a headache." Her voice landed with the cold finality of a closing door. I asked her what had happened. "Nothing," she said. It was the exact word I always gave to Blake. She didn't join us for dinner. I sat beside Blake, staring blankly at a menu I already knew by heart. Halfway through the appetizers, he leaned in and whispered. Sydney was at the mixer. I saw her talking to Vanessa for about 6 minutes. Thought you should know. I set my menu down. Everything I ate that night tasted like cardboard. When I returned upstairs, Vanessa was already on the sofa, her back turned, the blanket pulled tightly over her shoulder. On the desk, someone had pushed my silver Parker pen across the invisible boundary line we had established, sliding it back to my side like a customs officer returning a passport. Her own Parker was zipped securely inside her laptop sleeve. Kept. Gone. It was the clearest, most devastating answer I had ever received from another human being. The next morning at breakfast, Blake texted me from 3 tables away rather than walking over. Whatever Sydney told her, it's a lie. You know that. Go tell her. Vanessa sat by the window alone, picking at a dry slice of toast, her coffee untouched. In 3 years of intense corporate warfare, I had never seen her this quiet. Some people go quiet because they are at peace. She was not at peace. She was terrified. We had one final workshop that morning. She critiqued my draft with her usual sharp, cutting precision, but the bite was empty. She was using her intellect, not her heart. Blake kicked me hard under the table, nearly bruising my shin. Later, while the facilitator was wrapping up, Sydney cornered me one last time by the coffee station. She looked at the pen in my shirt pocket and smiled faintly. Still carrying that pen. Some things really never change. Some things don't need to, I replied. She held my gaze for a second longer than a stranger ever would, then walked away. I realized then, with cold clarity, that she had come to this resort knowing exactly what she wanted to destroy. Later that afternoon, standing by the darkened window of our room, Vanessa spoke without turning around. Foster, if I ever fought you in those meetings, it was because I could afford to. Not everything I've done around you was affordable. Before I could ask her what she meant, she reached out and clicked off the light. I lay awake on my side of the mattress that night, listening to her quiet breathing on the sofa, the faint smell of chlorine drifting from the outdoor pool, watching the shadows of the hanging bulbs sway against the drapes. For 3 years, I had assumed Vanessa's silence meant she disliked me. That night, I finally understood. Some people only go quiet when they are terrified of what they might say. And Sydney had always known exactly where to aim. On the final evening, I found her sitting at the very edge of the wooden dock behind the resort, her feet hovering just above the still water. The low autumn sun cast a long golden light across the lake. No boats, no other souls. I walked down the creaking planks and sat down 3 boards away. She didn't look up. I spoke first. I told her about Sydney. All of it. The 4 years of marriage, the 2 years of constant friction, the ultimatum to leave Halden and Kite, and the word small she had flung at me across our kitchen island. I told her about the child. There was no child, Vanessa. Sydney faked a pregnancy scare during our final summer when things were falling apart, using it to stall the divorce for 6 months. I didn't find out it was a lie until my attorney laid her medical records on the table and asked if I wanted to talk about them. I told her I wasn't angry at Sydney anymore, but I needed her to know that the story she had heard was a highly edited fiction. There was no baby. There was an ultimatum. I said no. That's the entire story. I stopped. The silence stretched between us for 30 agonizing seconds. She stared down at the water, and then her shoulders dropped by perhaps half a centimeter. It was a movement so minute I wouldn't have noticed it on anyone else, but I had spent 3 years unconsciously learning the language of her shoulders. She spoke without looking at me. Ken Lyons. 3 years ago this May. Side Hall B. A senior VP named Roland Keck spent 9 minutes publicly ripping apart a portfolio belonging to a 23-year-old junior designer I was mentoring. Her name was Priya Anand. She stopped breathing. I froze. And then a man on the panel cut him off. Calmly, without any drama. He turned the entire critique inside out until Priya could breathe again. She finally turned her head to look at me. "That was you, Foster." Fourth row. "I saw the silver pen in your pocket when you pointed at the slide." I couldn't speak. She told me she had applied to Halden and Kite 3 months after Cannes. She told herself it was for the career move and assumed I was still married because she was too afraid to look me up. By the time she joined and realized I was divorced, the armor was already on. The rival persona had been built. She kept it because it allowed her to sit in a room with me 4 times a week without ever having to ask a question she wasn't ready to be rejected on. "Every time I argued with you, Dylan, I was just buying myself another week of being allowed to look at you." She opened her small handbag, pulled out her silver Parker, and held it up in the fading amber light. "I bought this 2 days after Cannes, a little stationery shop on Rue Diatybe. I've never written a single word with it. I just carry it." She placed it on the weathered wood between us, the dying sun catching its metal casing in the exact same way it caught mine. I stared at the 2 pens. In my head, I was rewriting 3 years of history, every sharp interruption, every time she chose the chair right next to mine, her knowing my drink. 3 years of her looking right through me, and I had been entirely blind. My father used to say the truth is quiet, stubborn, and patient. Sitting on that dock, I finally understood him. I didn't kiss her. Not because I didn't want to, God, I wanted to, but because we had spent 3 years built on a misunderstanding, and I refused to start this next chapter with a gesture that could be misconstrued. Instead, I reached out, picked up her pen, turned it once in my fingers, and set it down perfectly parallel to mine. 2 silver Parkers, side by side on old cedar planks. "Then let's not waste any more time not looking at each other," I said. She smiled. A genuine, radiant smile, the first real one I had seen in 3 years. She said nothing. Later, as we walked back along the dark lake path, she murmured, "You know the worst part, Foster? Every time we argued, you actually listened. Nobody had ever truly listened to me argue before. I didn't have an answer beautiful enough for that, so I didn't try to make one." We walked back to our room, our hands not touching, but our shadows merging. Inside, I retrieved the extra blanket from the closet and made up the sofa. She climbed into the bed. Neither of us said goodnight. Neither of us needed to. I lay awake on the couch for a long time, realizing that for 3 years, I thought I was being sharpened by an enemy, when in reality, I was being kept warm by a woman who was simply terrified of the cold. We drove back to Chicago on Sunday. We didn't make a grand announcement. We simply stopped pretending. The following Monday morning at 7:15, at the tiny coffee shop on West Monroe and Wells, a place I had walked past for 8 years and never once entered, she was already sitting at the corner table with 2 cups. My coffee had the exact amount of sugar I liked. I sat down across from her. We didn't speak for 7 minutes. It was the most peaceful silence of my adult life. Blake walked in around minute 8. He saw us, stopped dead in his tracks, spun on his heel, walked right back out, and sent me a single-word text. Finally. We built our rhythms slowly, and none of them were loud. The night before any major pitch of hers, I would leave my father's silver Parker on her desk, capped, resting perfectly across her notebook. She never used it. She just kept it near her hand while she worked. The next morning, it would return to my desk, laid parallel to my keyboard. We never spoke of it. Blake noticed within a week, but, bless him, never said a word. 2 weeks after the retreat, Sydney sent me an email. "Coffee to talk?" Just 1 line in the body. I didn't reply. I dragged it into an empty folder named Archive. I didn't delete it. It felt important to know it was there, and to know I had actively chosen not to open it. 3 months in, A prestigious agency in Manhattan offered Vanessa a creative director role, a 40% raise, a corner office overlooking Bryant Park, and a signing bonus that would have wiped out her student loans. She declined it within 24 hours. She didn't tell me. I found out from Blake at the office espresso machine. Foster, she turned down a massive career jump. Have you asked her why? I told him I hadn't. Might be time, he said. I asked her that night in my condo. She was standing at the kitchen sink, washing the 2 wine glasses from our dinner. She didn't turn around. Not yet, she said softly. Not without you. I walked over, stood behind her, and placed my hand gently on her elbow. I felt her breathing hitch under my palm. The very first time I had touched her intentionally. It wasn't a cinematic, dramatic gesture. She kept washing the glass, but she leaned back into my hand by a fraction of an inch. That was all the answer I needed. 6 months after Lake Geneva, our team returned to the same resort for another retreat. Marissa was still working the front desk. She saw us walk up together, opened her mouth to speak, then thought better of it. She smiled warmly, printed a single key card, and handed it to Vanessa. Room 1408. On purpose this time. We dropped our bags and immediately walked down to the cedar dock. She reached into her purse, I reached into my shirt pocket, and we laid our 2 silver Parkers side by side on the wood, just as we had before. For the record, she murmured, and that was where I kissed her for the very first time. 7 months of waiting, and neither of us had been in any rush. At the 1-year mark on that very same dock at dusk, I asked her to marry me. I didn't drop to one knee. She would have hated the spectacle. I simply handed her a small box. She opened it, let out a beautiful, genuine laugh, and then handed me her silver Parker so I could sign our dinner receipt. It was a private joke only the 2 of us understood, and we would keep laughing at it for the rest of our lives. Walking back to the lobby, she smiled. You know what's funny, Foster? I originally bought that pen because I thought I'd never get to say your name out loud without a mahogany table between us. There's no table between us now, I said. I noticed. Our wedding was in my mother's backyard in Evanston, with 30 guests. Blake was my best man, and his toast ran 2 minutes over, ending in a tearful sniffle he tried to mask as a cough. Priya Anand flew all the way from London. Vanessa had invited her personally. Sitting in the front row, Priya cried too. During the vows, I saw her reach into her clutch and press her fingers against something inside. Later, she showed me her own silver Parker, bought the year after Cannes. I wore my father's pen in my suit pocket. Vanessa carried hers in a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her wedding dress. We signed our marriage certificate with 2 different silver pens. 2 years after Lake Geneva, we were promoted together, running the creative department at Halden and Kite as partners. Sterling Reed had been acquired by a British conglomerate, and Sydney had left advertising to open a boutique design firm in LA. My mother told me. I never looked her up. On the shared desk in our new office on the 14th floor, our 2 silver Parker pens live together in a single leather cup. Passers-by think they are just 2 writing utensils. Only we know they represent 2 parallel lines that spent 3 years fighting the current before finally finding each other. Priya still flies in from London every year around Cannes time. She always joins us for lunch, and every single year she asks me the same question. Do you remember what you said on that panel, Dylan? No. I always reply. She always laughs. Neither do I. I just remember that someone did. The years that followed have been slower, sweeter, and more peaceful than any I have ever known. It turns out, this quiet was exactly what I had always wanted, and had never known how to ask for. I am writing this from our shared desk on the 14th floor on a crisp Tuesday evening in October. Vanessa left an hour ago, and the office is perfectly still. In the leather cup in front of me sit the 2 silver Parker pens. I reach out and pick up my father's.